Tokyo, March 9, 1945. The city sleeps beneath a cold, windless sky. From above, the grid of streets glimmers faintly, neat and orderly. Wooden homes, paper walls, and narrow alleys packed with life. Then, a distant hum begins to rise. At first, it's mistaken for thunder, but within minutes, the sound grows. A steady, mechanical pulse that rolls across the darkened bay. The first black silhouettes appear against the moonlight. Giant silver bombers, B-29 Superfortresses, flying low and slow. Their engines throb in perfect unison. Down below, an air raid siren wails, fractured and late. Mothers shake sleeping children awake. Fire wardens rush to their posts. Soldiers on rooftops scan the horizon, still half believing the capital cannot be reached. But the sky opens. Thousands of small, dark canisters fall like rain, and when they strike, the city erupts. A spark, then a roar, then a wall of fire. Within minutes, entire districts vanish beneath a living storm of flame. Wind feeds the inferno, air turns to fire. Tokyo, a city that once mocked the idea of American bombers, now burns brighter than the sun. And this is how the night the Japanese believed impossible truly began. By early 1945, the Japanese Empire was fighting a war it could no longer win. The once glorious tide that had carried its armies across the Pacific now ebbed with relentless force. American submarines strangled Japan's shipping lanes. Oil convoys from the Dutch East Indies were cut to pieces in the South China Sea. Factories stood idle for lack of raw material, and hungry civilians rationed rice and coal. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had been shattered at Leyte Gulf only months earlier. Yet, within Tokyo's command circles, a stubborn pride persisted. The belief that the home islands were untouchable. That belief rested on geography and faith. Tokyo lay more than 1,500 miles from the nearest Allied base. Too far, the generals said, for any bomber to reach, strike, and return. Even after Saipan fell to the Americans in the summer of 1944, Japanese officers dismissed reports that a new aircraft could make the journey. The idea seemed absurd. They had not yet met the B-29 Superfortress. It was unlike anything the world had seen. 4 massive Wright R-3350 engines, a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a range of over 3,000 miles. Designed for precision bombing at altitudes above 30,000 feet, it was the largest and most advanced aircraft of the war. The Americans had poured billions into its creation, building entire airfields in the Mariana Islands solely for its use. In theory, it promised to bring war to the Japanese homeland. In practice, the results were disappointing. Early B-29 raids from China had failed, plagued by weather, technical failures, and fierce resistance from Japanese fighters. Bombing accuracy at high altitude was terrible. Jet stream winds blew bombs miles off target. Tokyo's air defense officers, reading intercepted reports of scattered strikes, scoffed at American inefficiency. To them, the Superfortress was just another Western boast. Still, in Washington, new leadership is prepared to turn failure into destruction. The U.S. Army Air Forces reorganized its campaign under the Fidian Bomber Command, based in the Marianas. Their mission? To burn Japan's war industry to ashes, factory by factory, city by city. By December 1944, American raids intensified. Yawata, Nagoya, Kobe. Each city felt the first taste of high-altitude bombing. Yet the damage was limited. Precision targeting failed. Clouds shielded the cities, and Japan's wooden architecture absorbed the impact better than expected. In frustration, the Americans searched for someone ruthless enough to rewrite the strategy entirely. That man arrived in January 1945. Major General Curtis LeMay, a compact, cold-eyed officer from Ohio, Famous for his mechanical discipline and lack of sentiment, LeMay did not believe in luck or theory. He believed in results, and the results, he saw, were failing. In meetings with his staff, he made it clear. The B-29's potential was being wasted. Japan's defenses were weak, its fire services primitive, and its cities built of paper. LeMay proposed something audacious. Abandon precision altogether. Attack not the factories, but the workers who built them. Use fire instead of explosives. Strike low at night with incendiary bombs. Even his peers hesitated. This was no longer strategic bombing. It was destruction on a biblical scale. Yet LeMay's logic was simple. To end the war quickly, Japan had to be broken from the inside. His decision would soon ignite the largest firestorm ever created by man. They knew what it meant. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was devastation. But for Curtis LeMay, logic was clear. Japan's war machine lived inside its cities. Break those cities, and the war collapses. So, he began to design Operation Meetinghouse, a single, overwhelming raid meant to test his new theory of destruction. LeMay's first step was to strip away everything that slowed the bombers down. The B-29's gunners, heavy armor plates, and excess fuel were removed. Each plane would fly lighter and lower, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, beneath the high-altitude jet streams that had scattered earlier raids. It was a radical risk. At that altitude, the bombers would be within reach of anti-aircraft fire and night fighters. But LeMay was gambling that Japan's defenses were too weak and disorganized to respond in time. Next came the weapon of choice, incendiaries. Instead of high-explosive bombs, the bays were packed with clusters of M69 napalm canisters, small, finned cylinders filled with jellied gasoline. Upon impact, they would burst and spray burning liquid in every direction, igniting wood, paper, and fabric. Mixed with magnesium and white phosphorus, they were designed to start fires that water could not extinguish. Tokyo was the perfect target. The eastern wards of the capital, Shitamachi, were among the most densely populated regions on Earth. Narrow streets, wooden homes packed wall to wall. Workshops and small factories are embedded within residential blocks. For centuries, the city had burned and been rebuilt from the same fragile materials. The Americans knew that once flames took hold, Tokyo's own construction would turn against it. LeMay and his planners studied wind patterns, humidity, and street maps. They calculated how fire would spread from block to block. On paper, it looked like a science experiment in destruction, a controlled burn on an unimaginable scale. To mark the boundaries of devastation, Pathfinder aircraft would drop magnesium flares in an X pattern, guiding the waves of bombers to focus their loads within a square of 4 by 5 miles, the very heart of Shitamachi. Once the first wave set the fires, the rest would feed them, hour after hour, until the fire consumed everything inside the grid. Even among LeMay's own men, whispers of doubt grew. Was this still war, or something else? Pilots who had trained for precision bombing were now prepared to target sleeping neighborhoods. One officer later recalled, "It felt like we were about to commit arson on a city." But LeMay brushed aside the hesitation. "If you kill enough of them," he said coldly, "they stop fighting." In early March 1945, final orders were issued. Weather reports confirmed clear skies and strong winds over Tokyo. Fuel lines were checked, bomb loads balanced, flight plans sealed. At dusk on March 9th, ground crews across the Mariana Islands watched as nearly 300 B-29 Superfortresses rolled onto the runways of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Their engines thundered in unison, shaking the earth. Each pilot knew tonight's mission was unlike any before it. They weren't flying for accuracy. They were flying to burn a city off the map. As the bombers lifted into the dark Pacific sky, a silent question lingered over every cockpit. What would the world look like when the sun rose again? Tokyo in early 1945 was a paradox, both ancient and modern, proud and fragile. From above, it was a maze of tightly packed streets, homes built from wood and paper, factories wedged between shrines and schools. Beneath its calm rhythm lay exhaustion. Air raid drills had become part of daily life, but most residents believed the capital itself was untouchable. American planes had come before, high and distant, leaving behind more noise than damage. People had learned to wait, to listen, and to exhale when the sirens faded. But on that March night, everything changed. Families carried buckets of sand beside futons. Mothers kept children's clothes ready by the door. Yet no one imagined the sky itself could fall. When the sirens finally screamed, it wasn't a warning. It was already too late. Civilians, not soldiers, would face the fire first. In that moment, war ceased to be distant. It became personal. At the center of this transformation stood Major General Curtis LeMay. He was not a man of emotion, but of efficiency. Short, solid, with the expression of a man perpetually unimpressed. His staff called him Iron Ass for his relentless discipline. LeMay viewed war as an equation: input, output, result. The human cost, though acknowledged, was not part of the formula. He believed that destroying Japan's will to fight required something more than strategy. It required terror. Yet LeMay's cold logic concealed its own unease. Privately, he understood what the mission implied. Tens of thousands of civilians would die. He justified it with the same words that had guided him since Europe. If it shortens the war, it saves lives in the long run. Still, not every man under his command shared that conviction. Pilots trained for precision bombing, the surgical strike, now found themselves loading incendiaries designed to set cities alight. Some wrestled quietly with doubt. One airman wrote in his diary, "We used to hit factories. Now we're told to hit homes. I wonder if there's a difference anymore." The technology that made it possible was equally extraordinary and terrifying. Each M69 incendiary cluster contained dozens of small bomblets. When released, the casing opened mid-air, scattering hundreds of canisters that spun downward, igniting on impact. The flames burned at over 1,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel and boil flesh. Each B-29 carried more than 7 tons of them. Multiplied by hundreds of aircraft, the effect was mathematical annihilation. These were not weapons of precision, but of chemistry. They consumed oxygen, created their own wind, and birthed firestorms powerful enough to uproot trees. Engineers in New Mexico had tested them on mock Japanese villages, perfect replicas built to burn. The results were studied, measured, and optimized. When LeMay approved the final plan, he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what would happen when those bombs met Tokyo's wooden heart. The city's fate was now tied to science, leadership, and cold determination, a convergence of human fear and mechanical progress that would change the nature of warfare forever. Inside Japan's military headquarters, confidence had turned into quiet disbelief. For years, officers in the Imperial General Staff had reassured the Emperor that Japan's homeland was secure. Radar coverage was sparse, but adequate. The air defense network, though thin, was sufficient. The home islands, they said, could withstand whatever the enemy sent. But by March 1945, even the most loyal commanders knew the truth. Their skies were open. The Japanese air defense system was stretched thin and outdated. Radar picked up the incoming aircraft too late. Searchlights swept empty air. Ammunition was scarce, and most skilled pilots had already fallen in the battles of the Philippines and Okinawa. The few night fighters left were antiquated, slow, underarmed, and nearly blind in darkness. On the ground, anti-aircraft crews waited for orders that came too late or not at all. The officers who had once scoffed at American technology now watched their own capital burn. They had believed the B-29s would fly too high, too far, too few. They had never imagined an attack at such low altitude, nor that Japan's capital would become the laboratory for a new kind of warfare. By dawn, their arrogance had vanished, consumed in the same flames that tore through Tokyo's streets. Across the Pacific, a different kind of turmoil gripped the American crews. Many were young, barely 20, sitting inside aluminum machines thousands of feet above a sleeping city. They had trained to strike at military targets, not civilians. Yet tonight's orders were clear, and there was no turning back. Some tried to reason with themselves. Japan had started this war. Japan had to be stopped. Others simply focused on their instruments, forcing their minds away from what waited below. As they released their bomb loads, the night beneath them transformed into a vast, glowing wound. From their cockpits, the city looked like a molten sea. One pilot later wrote, "It was beautiful and horrifying." Down below, the moral debate meant nothing. Fire didn't distinguish soldier from civilian, guilt from innocence. The flames devoured everything. But above, within those bombers, the line between victory and atrocity blurred forever. Many of those men would later struggle to justify what they had done, some believing it necessary, others haunted by it for the rest of their lives. Psychologically, the raid marked a fracture on both sides. For Japan, the illusion of invincibility died that night. For the Americans, a threshold had been crossed. The moment when technology and strategy fused into an act so devastating that even the victors would question its humanity. The world had entered a new era, one where cities, not armies, became the battlegrounds of modern war. Shortly before midnight on March 9, 1945, the first formation of B-29s crossed the Japanese coastline. The ocean below was black and endless. Ahead, the faint glow of Tokyo shimmered through the haze, a city unaware that within an hour it would become a furnace. Each bomber flew lower than ever before, engines throttled back to avoid detection. There was no moon, no flak bursts yet, only the steady drone of propellers slicing the night. Inside the lead aircraft, crewmen checked their watches. 12:07 a.m. Time to begin. The first wave dropped strings of magnesium flares, outlining the target zone in a fiery X. Tokyo Bay reflected their light like molten glass. Seconds later came the second wave, 279 aircraft sweeping in from the south and west, bomb bays yawning open. What fell was not explosive thunder, but a storm of fire. Tens of thousands of M69 canisters cascaded down, tumbling and spinning before bursting on impact. Each one scattered napalm in liquid ribbons that clung to everything it touched. Within minutes, the Shitamachi district, a maze of workshops, homes, and markets, ignited from end to end. Flames leaped from house to house faster than anyone could run. The air filled with a shrieking wind, a vacuum of oxygen feeding the inferno. Roof tiles exploded, power lines melted, wooden walls collapsed in showers of sparks. Firefighters rushed into the streets with hand pumps and sand buckets, useless against the heat now roaring through entire neighborhoods. The fire created its own weather, sucking in air from all directions. Winds reached hurricane strength, bending flames into spirals that spun like living creatures. People fled toward the rivers, only to find bridges already choked with bodies. Those holapet into the water faced boiling currents and floating debris set ablaze. Entire families vanished in the smoke, their cries carried away by the same wind that fanned the fire. Above it all, the B-29 crews watched in stunned silence. From their altitude, the city no longer looked real. It was a moving field of orange and red, punctuated by explosions of light where fuel depots or factories ignited. Some gunners wept. Others stared wordlessly through their windows, unable to look away. By 1:30 a.m., the fire had merged into a single storm, a solid sheet of flame devouring everything within a radius of miles. It was no longer Tokyo. It was a living, breathing inferno. By 2:00 a.m., Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a sea of fire. The air burned to breathe. Smoke turned night into something darker than darkness itself. Those still alive crawled, not ran, as the heat stripped the oxygen from their lungs. Mothers carried children wrapped in wet cloths that steamed and dried within seconds. Fire whirled through the narrow lanes like liquid wind. The firestorm raged in spirals. Flames rose hundreds of feet high, twisting together into columns that fused and collapsed under their own weight. Asphalt bubbled. Iron shutters melted. Entire blocks disappeared in the span of minutes. People sought refuge in canals and ponds, but the fires followed, sucking the air away until even the water itself boiled. Witnesses later described the sound as a howling monster. The roar of 1,000 furnaces merged into one. From above, the bombers circled to drop their final loads. The crews could see the blaze from nearly 150 miles away, an expanding orange wound visible across the Pacific horizon. Radio chatter fell silent. No one spoke. Over the intercoms came only the steady drone of engines and the crackle of static. Some pilots were sickened by what they saw. Others hardened themselves, repeating the mission's justification. This was the price to end the war. Yet none could deny what unfolded below. They were witnessing not combat, but the erasure of a civilization's heart in real time. Tokyo's defenders tried to respond, but coordination disintegrated within minutes. Anti-aircraft guns overheated or ran out of shells. Night fighters took off blindly into the smoke, only to lose direction and crash in the darkness. Radio lines went dead. Headquarters at Ichigaya could only guess at what was happening. Their city map already obsolete, burning from its own edges inward. At 3:00 a.m., the fires began merging toward the Imperial Palace grounds. The flames stopped only when they reached the open moat. Not by resistance, but by exhaustion. More than 16 square miles had been reduced to ash. By 4:00 a.m., the raid was over. The last B-29s turned for home, their crews glancing back at the inferno fading behind them. On the ground, silence followed. Heavy, unreal. Those who survived crawled out from shelters to find the world unrecognizable. Rivers choked with bodies, streets carpeted with charred remains, the smell of burned wood and flesh blending into a single, unforgettable stench. Tokyo's officers had once laughed at the notion of American bombers reaching their skies. Now, standing before a horizon still glowing red, they understood what had come to pass. They had not been defeated in battle. They had been consumed by fire. When dawn broke on March 10, 1945, the sun rose over a wasteland. Where once lay the beating heart of Tokyo, schools, shrines, homes, and factories, there was only gray ash and silence. Smoke still coiled into the morning air, blotting out the horizon. The few who survived walked barefoot through what had been streets, stepping over fragments of pottery, twisted bicycles, and bodies blackened beyond recognition. Official surveys would later estimate that more than 100,000 people had died in a single night. Some historians place the number even higher. Another 1 million were left homeless. 16 square miles of the capital had been erased. It was, and remains, the deadliest air raid in human history. More lethal than Dresden, Hamburg, or even the atomic bombings that would follow. The Shitamachi district, once the bustling artisan quarter of Tokyo, was gone. Entire families vanished from records. Firefighters who tried to fight the flames perished in their hoses' paths, trapped between collapsing buildings and surging heat. Hospitals overflowed with burn victims. The riverbanks, choked with corpses, were later cleared by soldiers in gas masks, who shoveled the remains into trenches. Among the ashes, some fragments survived. A half-melted teapot, a child's sandal, a watch stopped at 12:37 a.m. They became symbols of a night too vast to comprehend. American reconnaissance aircraft returned later that morning to photograph the result. The images showed an empty scar where neighborhoods had been, a grid of streets turned white by ash. To commanders at Guam, the mission was declared an overwhelming success. The bombing achieved its objective with near-total efficiency. Curtis LeMay's gamble had worked. Tokyo's industrial base, its small workshops that fed the war machine, had been obliterated. The psychological blow was even greater. For the first time, Japan's civilians understood that no corner of their homeland was beyond reach. Reports from Japan's Home Ministry, intercepted weeks later, described mass panic and despair. The government tried to hide the full scale of the disaster, but the truth spread faster than censorship could contain it. The capital's heart was gone. The empire's spirit was bleeding. Yet among the American crews, victory felt hollow. When they landed on the Marianas, their debriefing officers congratulated them on a record-breaking operation. But the airmen were quiet. Some refused to speak. Others stared into the distance, still seeing the glow of the burning city etched against their eyes. The mission had achieved what it set out to do, and in doing so, had changed the meaning of warfare itself. In the days that followed, Tokyo ceased to function as a capital. Government ministries relocated to undamaged suburbs. Transportation collapsed. Communication lines melted into silence. Trains carried the wounded south toward Nagoya and Kyoto, their passengers wrapped in sheets instead of bandages. The imperial household, shielded within its stone walls, received only fragments of news. Courtiers reported that the emperor listened in silence, his face expressionless as the destruction was read aloud. No official condemnation came, only a quiet acknowledgement. The war was approaching its end. For Japan's military, the implications were catastrophic. The raid had exposed the total vulnerability of the home islands. Generals who had once promised protection now faced the impossible task of defending a nation made of wood against an enemy that commanded the skies. When the Americans struck again, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, the pattern repeated. Entire cities disappeared in weeks. By summer, more than 60 Japanese urban centers had been reduced to ashes. The air war had become an instrument of extermination. LeMay's methods grew even more efficient. He introduced double raids, second waves timed to hit firefighters and survivors. He later admitted with chilling candor, "If we'd lost the war, I'd have been tried as a war criminal." But he did not lose, and in that paradox lay the moral fracture of modern warfare. The United States had justified the campaign as a means to save lives, to end the war swiftly, to prevent an invasion that would cost millions. Yet, the scale of civilian death in Tokyo forced new questions. Where was the line between strategy and terror? Between necessity and cruelty? These questions would follow LeMay and the world into the atomic age. In Japan, the survivors carried their grief quietly. Diaries recovered decades later speak of numbness, not hatred. "The city burned, and so did we," one woman wrote. "We were no longer human, only shadows." Thousands more never spoke of that night at all. But the silence that hung over Tokyo was not just one of mourning. It was the silence of realization that Japan's empire, forged in conquest and pride, was now collapsing under its own hubris. The same officers who had mocked the idea of American bombers now faced a truth they could not deny. The war they began had come home. By mid-1945, Japan's government began to grasp the inevitable. Air raids were a daily fact of life. Production had halted. Morale had broken. And when the atomic bombs fell in August, few in Tokyo were surprised. The fire had already shown them what the end of the world looked like. When the fires of Tokyo finally died, what remained was more than ruin. It was a mirror, reflecting the face of a new kind of war. The raid of March 9 to 10, 1945, marked the moment when technology and morality collided. No longer were armies the sole bearers of destruction. Now, entire populations stood within the crosshairs. The Tokyo firebombing did not just devastate a city, it transformed warfare itself, from battlefields of soldiers to battlefields of civilians. For Japan, it was the beginning of surrender, though months of suffering still lay ahead. For the United States, it was the moment when efficiency triumphed over empathy, a haunting precedent that would culminate in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The skies over Tokyo were not just filled with fire, they were filled with questions humanity still struggles to answer. Curtis LeMay would later reflect that his mission ended the war faster. Others would argue it ended something deeper, the belief that war could ever be fought cleanly again. Today, when historians speak of that night, they do not speak of victory or defeat. They speak of the wind, the flames, and the silence that followed. A silence so complete, it felt eternal. Tokyo rose again from its ashes. The scars were paved over, rebuilt, and forgotten by many. Yet, beneath its neon skyline, the memory remains of a night when the skies turned to fire, and the world learned what total war truly meant. Because in that moment, humanity glimpsed its own power and its own darkness, reflected in the burning heart of a city.